Okay, this video has to do with chapter 5 and has to do with sampling. And the overarching question for this chapter is, do you have the money to survey all the fifth graders? When researchers are doing this, the answer to this previous question is, well, no, probably not. And more importantly, they don't need the money to research all the fifth graders. They do something called sampling. They select a smaller group of people that they can be reasonably sure represents all the fifth graders in the country. And there are two overarching ways to do this. There's called tangible populations and abstract populations. I want to kind of jump down to the bottom here. The biggest difference between a tangible population and an abstract population is, and if you have an equal chance of selecting from the entire population yourself, and everybody in that population has a chance of being selected, that's tangible. If you don't, and you are making up a group of people to represent a population, that's abstract. And that's the difference between those two. Tangible means that you really did have access to everybody that you said your population would be represented by your sample. Abstract is taking a small group and making it up and saying this represents what I think all fifth graders are, for example. I have two examples that I want you to look at. I'm going to put these in the discussion boards. I'm going to assign people to two groups. And these are two different ways of studies that I've conducted where we've gone through and created samples for a population. So I'm going to assign people to groups to look at those. And rather than lecturing through each part of these, I'm going to have several different discussion threads that you need to participate in the class. So I'm trying to get away from doing too much lecturing and putting the work back on the students so that because I think it's easier to learn it that way. The second thing is understanding the relationship between a statistic and a parameter. What it comes down to is when you talk about a sample from a group, you use statistics to do that. When you talk about the characteristics of a population, you use parameters. Very often we'll be stuck with the statistics because we don't really know what the population is. So therefore, we don't really know what the parameters are because we never really had access to the entire population. Very often people will ask this question of how big does the sample have to be, especially when they get into their study. There is something called a document called sample size located in the chapter 5 documents. So for a population N, the big N, you have to have a certain sample size, little n. So if you have 10 people in a population, you have to survey all 10 of them. If you have 100 people in the population you're trying to describe, you have to survey 80 of them. But what I want you to notice is as this n gets larger, the little n does not increase at the same rate. So when we double the n population from 100 to 200, we don't double the little n. It gets progressively smaller, so that by the time you get to 100,000 in your population, you only need 384. And that's why it is when you see the election polls or the election turnouts, when they'll do a sample, they only have about 1,500 people because they only need 1,500 people to really represent the population. Okay. Next thing I want you to do is look at a document called probability samples. And once again, I will be putting a discussion item into discussion thread, and there are several things I'm going to put in here about probability samples. It's very important to understand that you can still do in probability samples tangible or abstract populations. It has to do with what you have access to. So these are very short, and I'll divide the class up into each of these situations. But it's important that you look at other people's situations because these are 4 different types of sampling techniques that you need to be familiar with. And the other thing I want you to realize is that some sampling techniques employ multiple methods. They'll start out with a random sample and they'll switch to a convenience sampling, or they'll start out with a convenience sample and they'll stratify it, or they'll start out with a convenience sample and then switch to purposeful sampling. That's okay. That happens a lot. One of the important questions for you to consider is when you're reading research articles and it said the researcher conducted a random sample, you need to look for certain things. Here's what you need to look for. One, we want to know that his sample is large enough to represent the population he is claiming. Two, we want to know if there are subgroups, do these samples and the subgroups have enough to represent their population? They'll often not be equal. For example, if he had 1,000 people in his population, and he was subdividing that into ethnic groups, well, he's not going to have equal parts of the ethnic groups in his population. He might have 500 Caucasian, 300 African Americans, and 200 Hispanics. Well, if you remember back to that table, you're not going to have equal parts of those. You're not going to have 1/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic, 1/3 Caucasian. And actually, you'll have to have proportionally more Hispanics than you would African Americans or Caucasians. The other thing to keep in mind is if the sample is not large enough, that's okay as long as the researcher himself is making sure that the readers understand that it's not, and proposes that as a limitation of his study. The other next thing we're going to look at is non-probability sampling. Those of you who are in counseling special ed areas, this is the one that you're going to be most familiar with. That means that not everybody has an equal chance of being selected. You can make inferences from non-probability sampling, but they're a lot harder to do. They're very limited because you'll have single case designs or case studies where you're looking at small groups of people, and that's all right. That's just the nature of special education and counseling research studies. Once again, what do you look for? You look for how many subjects are in the sample and who are you saying that sample is supposed to represent. I'm going to have a set of examples of non-probability sampling that I want you to look at. There's about 5 of those. Those will be included in the discussion board. Now, one of the things that you need to consider is what you're going to be doing. Given what you know about sampling, what type of sampling would you anticipate people using? Most people use convenience sampling if they're going to do surveys, or as I said, single case or case study designs. That's going to end this section of this video, and there'll be another one that wraps up the end of Chapter 5.